So first, thank you everybody for being here on a Friday night. And thanks to the Consciousness Hacking organization and Mikey and Josh Meadows, Josh Fields for really kind of making this happen. And I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to dive in because I've got really way more material than we have time for. And so I want to cover as much as possible. So the idea is going to be to cover about 45 minutes-ish of content and then have some time for questions and answers, and then we'll move into more of the discussion for the evening in smaller groups. So before I just dive into the material, I wanted to give you just a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, why I'm talking about this, and what my background is, because that influences, of course, my angle on this conversation. And so I'm a psychologist, and Josh mentioned I'm in Eugene, Oregon. I've been there for about 6 months, and I was joking with Josh that it's when I moved there, I was like, oh man, this is like Hippieville. And I was like, what, really? It's super Hippieville. If you've ever been to Eugene, Oregon, it's like, wow. But I like it. Anyway, I'm a psychologist. I'm also board certified in neurofeedback. Most of you are probably familiar with neurofeedback, attaching some sort of electrodes to the scalp to measure brainwave activity. I've been doing that in the psychology world for about 20 years. And then I also have a background in meditation and Qigong and yoga and some other practices like that, about 20 years as well. So these are some areas of both career but also sort of love and interest. And so over time I've been kind of marrying those things. And then really in the last 5 years, it's taken a slightly different angle, which is kind of what this slide is. And then in the last couple of years, it's kind of shifted to include things like psychedelic states, which is everybody here, I'm sure, it's like, yeah, that's what we want to talk about. Yeah, I know. So just briefly, I'm the director of the Institute of NeuroMeditation. That's our space in Oregon, and we teach classes and have events and workshops and work with individuals combining meditation with technology. That's what we do. And I wanted to give a shout out to Richard Suter because that's where I stole the name NeuroMeditation. That was the first place I heard it from, and so I wanted to at least acknowledge him in that. And he was very gracious. When I decided I was going to use that name, I sent him an email and said, hey, Richard, is it cool if I use this name? And he didn't respond. And I was like, huh. So I just kind of did it anyway. And I was like a little bit nervous about it. And then I saw him at a conference. And I was like, oh man. And went up to him and I was like, hey, did you get my email? And he's like, what email? I was like, right. And he was super gracious. He's like, I'm glad you're doing this. Great, take it. So I did. So what happened was a few years back, I was invited to write a book chapter about combining neurofeedback with meditation. So that's what started this whole thing. Was when I was invited to do that, I said, yeah, that's great. But then it really it forced me to think a bit more about what that would really mean. In the good old days, the way that we did that was it was all alpha training, reward alpha in the back of the head. And that was kind of the only way that we approached meditation with neurofeedback. And it occurred to me that we know more now. There has to be other approaches. And so that's what I kind of outlined in this book. That became a workshop that I did for a company called PESI for a number of years. Then it became a book. And then we developed the Institute. So initially what we did was we organized 4 different styles of meditation that we could very clearly tie to different brain states. And so this is all based in the research literature. We didn't make this up. We didn't do the research. We read all of the research and said, how can we identify different states of consciousness in meditation and then use EEG technology to help people tune into that? So the names that we use for those states are focus, concentration type practices, mindfulness. Everybody's at least familiar with that term. We're using a definition of that, pretty much the definition John Kabat-Zinn uses, sort of a being aware of what's happening in the present moment without attachment, allowing things to just pass. quiet mind. This is going to be more of your Zen kind of TM type practices. And then open heart, including all the loving kindness, compassion, forgiveness, those types of practices. So essentially, we've been able to identify that there are different brain waves that occur with each of these states of consciousness and in different brain regions. And so because we know that, we can then kind of feed that information back to somebody while they're meditating to help them find those states. So this is what we've been up to for the last several years. That's what the book chapter was all about, was kind of outlining this. And then just recently, we've kind of stumbled into what we're calling the fifth style. We keep changing what we call this. So sometimes it's altered states, sometimes it's deep states. I like deep states. The only reason I'm hesitant to use that is because that has another connotation in neurofeedback. Well, it has a lot of connotations, apparently. But in the neurofeedback world, deep states means something slightly different than the way I'm using it. So right now we're using altered states. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on tonight, is how we are starting to target and work with altered states with neurofeedback. So first we have to do a little bit of background of how and why we're looking at this and how we're approaching it, really. And so it all sort of begins with all of the recent research that's been done with psychedelic medicines. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a lot of the research, a lot of it being done by Robin Carhart Harris and his group. There's a lot of other groups that are doing this research. In fact, we've got somebody in this room who's published research on Dr. Wan up here, looking at 5-MeO and brainwave patterns. So anyway, one of the things that's very interesting is if you take all of that research and kind of boil it down, there's differences for sure. And actually, we were just talking about that. Might be a good discussion later. There's differences even between different forms of 5-MeO in terms of subtle differences in terms of what you see in the brain. However, by and large, there's kind of consistent patterns that you see whether you're talking about LSD or psilocybin or ayahuasca or 5-MeO. And these are just some of them kind of highlighted. You see a decrease in general of cerebral blood flow. So a decrease of blood flow. And particularly in a region of the brain called the default mode network. And if you're not familiar with that, I'm going to outline it for you in a few minutes, what the default mode network is. You see decreased EEG activity. So the power of the brain waves goes down. Especially alpha brain waves drop, and especially in a region called the posterior cingulate cortex, which, by the way, happens to be the hub of the default mode network. Decreased current source density. It's another kind of EEG metric, essentially. Again, especially alpha, especially the PCC. You see decreased connectivity between the default mode network and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is, of course, largely involved in memory. So this is interesting. And again, when we get into brain structures in a second, this will be more important. And then this is one I just kind of added on. This wasn't on my original slide, but there's enough research now, I think, that it deserves a little bullet point that you do see, especially with certain things, ayahuasca, 5-MeO for sure. You see increases in high beta and gamma. So it's interesting. All of the other brain waves tend to drop, except high beta and or gamma, and they tend to come up a bit. So obviously this is going to be important for us, thinking about how do we take this and apply it to neurofeedback. We need to understand what the brain waves are up to and where and why. So just by way of example, I want to sort of make it a little bit more concrete. This was somebody we did a little case study with last year, and somebody that has a lot of experience working with various medicines, but especially 5-MeO, had done quite a lot of 5-MeO. At the point that we did this case study, this person had not used 5-MeO at all for 18 months. So this was the first time in a long time. And so we were, it's like, well, hey, let's map your brain. Let's hook you up, see what it looks like at baseline. And then let's see what it looks like after, while you're smoking 5-MeO. And so we took that data and essentially compared them. And this is kind of a snapshot of what we got. So what you're looking at is the difference. These are little difference maps between before and during. And so green means there was really no change. It was about the same. If there's blue colors, it means there's a decrease of activity. And if there's brighter colors like red, there's an increase of activity. So you can see here that there was a decrease of delta, a decrease of theta, decrease of alpha. Beta didn't do a whole lot. There's a little, that could be some artifact, some sort of eye, something that snuck in there, eye wiggles or something. But you see back here at the occipital lobe, there's a little bit of an increase of activity. Same thing with high beta. And then look at gamma. It's like, whoa, huge increase of gamma, especially on the right side, which may also be important. It's at least interesting. So I just wanted to bring this up because this is one person, but it mimics exactly what you see in a lot of the research literature, or at least pretty close. When you break it down, so there's a technique that we use with EEG. It's called S-Loretta. And essentially what it allows you to do is extrapolate from the surface down into deeper brain regions, kind of like an fMRI, so that you can see the activity where it's coming from in deeper brain regions. Now, you can't get all the way down to certain regions that you can with an fMRI, but you can still see a lot. And so this was the same person, the same data set, but we just used that S-Loretta technique to say, well, what about some of these regions that we think might be important connected to the default mode network, for example? So the inferior parietal lobules are connected to the default mode network. And you can see, especially on the right side again, so for whatever reason, this person had a lot of shifting on the right, much more so than on the left. The Precuneus, that's part of that hub of the default mode network back here. You see that decrease. And then I looked at the insula. The insula is involved in a lot of things, but partly what it's involved in is awareness of emotion or basic emotional expression. And I wanted to look at that because this person had a very emotional response to their experience at the moment. So I wanted to see, I wonder what the insula is up to. And it's like, whoa, it's lit up. And by the way, the right side of the insula tends to be more felt emotion, like you feel it in your body. You know, like when you have heartache and your heart hurts, that's the right side. If you're thinking about emotions, that's more on your left side. So clearly he was engaged with, a bodily expression of emotion. So let's break this down a little bit. Let's talk about what the default mode network is and does. So the default mode network, let me back up one step. The brain works in networks. We like to kind of talk about little parts of the brain as if they all do separate things and, they're all responsible for their own little things. And that's somewhat true, but by and large, all those areas are working together to accomplish larger tasks. So now we know that there are networks that tend to work together, and there are some that are very well defined. The default mode network is one of those. And you read different things, and they're going to throw different brain regions in there, but by and large, the medial frontal cortex, the inferior parietal lobules, and the posterior cingulate, this is the back of the head back here, kind of comprise this. Now, the default mode network is really important, and it's interesting for meditation and for psychedelic states, because the default mode network is really all about you thinking about yourself. So they talk about self-referencing. So, that's one of the things that comes up a lot. Self-centered mental imagery. You're seeing yourself in the past, in the future. You're imagining yourself. Memory. Again, you're seeing yourself. Reflective self-awareness. You're thinking about yourself. All of these things have to do with you thinking about yourself or something in relation to yourself. So you can see where this is going to become important with things like meditation, where largely you're trying to not do that or learn how to teach the brain to not do that all the time, right? To shift into something else where you're not listening to that sort of ego and shifting into connecting to something bigger, perhaps. And you can also apply this to psychedelic states, right? I mean, a lot of what people talk about in psychedelic states is sort of ego dissolution, things like that. You don't think of yourself the same way anymore. So it makes sense that the default mode network is going to be an important structure in terms of both of those states. So I've mentioned the posterior cingulate and the precuneus a couple of times. I wanted to bring it up specifically. because it really is the hub of the default mode network. It's the center point of the default mode network. And in that way, it kind of directs everything else. And even some of these statistics, when you look at them, it's fairly impressive. So the cerebral blood flow and the metabolic rate in the posterior cingulate are 40% higher than the average rest of the brain. It's like, well, what does that mean? It means you're using your posterior cingulate a lot. It's getting a lot of action. It's very active. But again, if you think about that, how much of your day, how much of your life do you spend thinking about yourself? A lot. Basically, if you're not doing something else, you're thinking about yourself. That's kind of the way that it works. And it's interesting because that's a natural part of the brain. I think this is important in terms of meditation instruction, understanding that it's like, that's just literally, it's what the brain does. Like, you're wired to do this. So because you do that, it doesn't mean you're bad. It means you're normal. Yes.
Is that true across cultures?
Yeah, as far as we know, it kind of has the same function. Now, it's probably going to look different in different cultures, or it may mean something different. So that's an interesting question, because if you go back here, look at all the things. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of what the default mode network can be up to. So there's a lot of angles that it can take, a lot of different paths that it can take. It's actually, I don't want to go too far sideways on this, but it's an interesting and important question, because we have a tendency to want to demonize brainwaves or demonize parts of the brain. It's like, oh, the default mode, oh, it's bad. You're thinking about yourself. It's like, no, it's not bad. It's like, even if you think about self-reflection, is self-reflection bad? It's like, well, no. Well, you need your default mode network to do that. So it's like, how are you using your default mode network, and when are you using it? That's the key. Which gets down to here. The default mode network and the posterior cingulate, serves as a central orchestrator of global brain function. It's involved in coordinating a lot of different aspects of mental activity. And if there are dysfunctions in the default mode network, particularly back here, it's very often related to mental health concerns. So again, that's my background. I'm a psychologist. And it is not uncommon at all if somebody comes into the office and they're complaining of some kind of concern like anxiety or depression, that something's going on back here that does not look typical. Usually it's overactive. There's too much activity there. Makes sense, right? If you're thinking about yourself too much, probably you're going to be anxious or depressed or both. And we already talked about, too, that it's also impacted by meditation. There was a great study done by the folks at Harvard. There's a team at Harvard that's been doing a lot of brain imaging studies with mindfulness in particular. And they did an MRI study looking at the thickness of the cortex before and after an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction class. And what they found was that one of the areas of the brain that grew significantly in 8 weeks was the posterior cingulate. Because you're using it. You're learning how to use it differently. You're exercising it. Hey, there we go. Some magic mushrooms. So,
Can I just ask a question? When you said they grew significantly, do you mean literally there were like more neurons in that part of the brain? Because 8 weeks seems like a pretty short period of time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that kind of brain growth took place in such a short
Yeah, the plasticity is, so we can't, I don't know that we can necessarily say that it grew brain cells, but the connectivity, and you can definitely see that. You can see that happen almost instantaneously. You can watch brain cells grow and connect moment to moment. It's amazing. So the brain is super plastic, which is, for me, what's very exciting is because, yes, you are to some extent, you get what you're born with, to some extent. And we have a lot of ability to shift and change that as well, more than we think we do. So yeah, you can show significant growth in certain brain regions in as little as 8 weeks. They've done that with jugglers. You can see that with jugglers. You don't juggle, and you juggle for a few weeks, and you measure your brain again, and the regions of the brain involved in coordinated movement grow.
Comment. I just read a recent paper that many of the neural networks are dormant in the brain. this is studies, animal studies and human studies. And so we have all these pathways which are sitting there and not being used, and they can be kicked into activity with certain stimuli, external and internal.
Like psychedelics?
That's, yeah.
Just asking. So back to this. So I mentioned Robin Carhart Harris. He really, I think, deserves a lot of credit for really launching kind of where the field is going right now with psychedelic medicines. I mean, he is a publishing machine. I mean, I think he's already, 6 or 7 really solid, really well done psychedelic medicine articles where it's a very controlled environment. They're measuring the brain and using all kinds of different technologies, really sophisticated stuff. Anyway, this is one of his earlier studies with psilocybin, and I bring it up here because of its connection to what we've been talking about with the default mode network. So in this one, they were looking at blood flow patterns, and their hypothesis going into the study was that people who were using psilocybin, a significant dose of psilocybin, would show an increase of blood flow in the default mode network. That was their hypothesis. So this is before we really kind of had a good sense of what was going on here. And, I've read that article multiple times, and he doesn't really say why that was the hypothesis. He just, that was the hypothesis. My guess is that, again, if you have to think about it, it's like, okay, wait a minute. We know that people who have big psychedelic experiences, they think about themselves differently. Okay. Well, if you just kind of think about that, it's like, wouldn't that suggest maybe an increase of activity in that region? It makes sense. It's sort of a logical way to think about it. I don't know that that's what he was thinking, but it makes sense. Anyway, here was the conclusion, and this is from the paper. The high normal metabolic activity of the posterior cingulate and the default mode network with which it is associated has led some to speculate about its functional importance, positing a role in consciousness and high-level constructs such as the self or ego. Indeed, the default mode network is known to be activated during self-referencing and other high-level functions linked to the self-construct. So the reason that I'm highlighting this is because really more and more we're starting to kind of think about the default mode network as being the sort of physical material of the ego. It's how we think about ourselves. It's our identity. It's your sense of self. That's the brain that's kind of doing that. That's constantly telling you who you are. And so this becomes really important in terms of what happens when you disrupt that. So that's kind of part one, kind of thinking about this and thinking about, okay, you can see where I'm going with this. It's like if I'm thinking about neurofeedback, and it's like, okay, we've already identified a few things that might be important. How do we get to the default mode network? That's kind of key, right? We got to figure out how to get to that. But there's other pieces that are important as well. And so one of these is this idea of, because again, my background, I'm a psychologist. And so it's kind of like, well, what's the point exactly? Sure, it can be fun to experience different states of consciousness, but what's the point? Why am I doing this? How does this help people? And so there's actually some research, some of the other psychedelic research has shown that people who report a mystical experience during their psychedelic journey are much more likely to show positive mental health outcomes. There's a very strong correlation between mystical experience and positive mental health outcome. So when you think about that, it's like, okay, another study looked at it and said the strongest predictor of a mystical experience was a decrease of alpha and delta in the default mode network back there at the posterior cingulate. So now we're getting even more specific, right? It's like, okay, decreased activity in the posterior cingulate, but now it's like, well, actually alpha and delta seem to be kind of the biggies there if we're really trying to go for something big that's going to have a big therapeutic outcome. And then we have to bring up gamma waves because those are the only ones that seem to increase. And they don't always increase, but they increase often enough that it's important. So gamma, is kind of the exciting kind of newish brainwave that everybody's all excited about now and wants to talk about. When I first got into neurofeedback, gamma didn't even exist. Well, it existed, but nobody talked about it, And still, you pick up a book and it'll say something like, there are 4 brain waves, delta, theta, alpha, beta. That's super way oversimplified, by the way. But now people are trying to say, there's 5 brain waves, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. Gamma's getting a lot of attention. It's pretty much the fastest brain wave that we're really doing much with right now. By the way, we know the brain goes faster than that. We know it goes a lot faster than that. But just like a few years ago, we weren't measuring gamma because we didn't have the equipment and we didn't know what it did. We're not measuring 100 hertz in the brain because it's kind of like, we are, but most people aren't.
How much is a lot faster? That's what
I don't know. I know that people are going up to 100. 200?
Yeah, the electrocortical brains, surgical patients where they can put electrodes directly on the cortex. So there's no attenuation from membranes or skull thickness or anything. Yeah, several hundred hertz being recorded and published.
Which is very interesting. And it probably goes faster than that. Technology, right? I mean, it's like we're kind of limited by that and limited by our understanding. What you're seeing now is that people are starting to call gamma, I put 35 to 50 hertz on here, which is fairly safe because a lot of the research kind of wants to center around 40 hertz. So 35 to 40, it gives you some wiggle room. But now you're seeing people talking about gamma being anywhere from 30 up to as far as they go. And again, to me, it's like, I bet there's other stuff going on in there. It's probably not just gamma. There's probably some other more subtleties that we want to pay attention to. Anyway, I wanted to bring up gamma because one of the reasons that it's getting a lot of attention is because of some of the things it's associated with and that we're finding it connected to. And so here's some examples. First let me kind of give you just a quick overview. So certainly gamma is involved in conscious attention. So you'll see increases of gamma when you're engaged. If you're measuring the frontal lobes and somebody's focused on a task, you're going to see some gamma increase there. It's like, okay, well, that's not super special. You see that with other brain waves as well. But it does seem to have this property of being associated with what they call the binding problem. So it's taking all of the information and bringing it together in a way of sort of a higher understanding. One of the ways that I think about it, and it's oversimplified, but you'll get the idea, it's kind of like, having those aha moments where everything comes together and you understand something at a high level, but you're not really working at it. You know those moments? So to me, that feels a little bit more like a gamma moment. You get this little gamma burst where it's like you get it at a very high level. And that connects to some of the research that we see. You see this super increase of gamma activity in, for example, expert musicians when they're listening to music. Expert musicians, when they're listening to music, they understand music at a very high level. I love music, and I can promise you there's no gamma when I'm listening to music. It's, you can love it all you want, but you don't understand it at that level, right? Or expert meditators. So there's been lots of research with this lately showing increases of gamma activity in, Tibetan monks when they're doing a compassion meditation, for example. So these are monks, that's their job, is to meditate, all day. And so it's like they're very good at it, presumably. And so with them, you're seeing these huge increases of gamma. Again, you don't necessarily, in fact, you don't. There is research looking at expert meditators versus novice meditators. You do not see those patterns with the novices. You see it with the experts. There's a different level of understanding. You see it in lucid dreaming. That's interesting. You see it with ayahuasca, which we already mentioned, and with 5-MeO. And you see it in the dying brain. So I've got a little asterisk there because this was done with rats. So just a caveat. At the moment of death, and shortly thereafter, there was this huge burst of gamma activity. This is all curious. What does this mean? And it's like, well, we don't know, but it's interesting, isn't it? So when we're talking about altered states neuromeditation, what are we talking about exactly? Well, obviously we're going to hook somebody up. We're going to put some electrodes on their head or a cap on their head. Like in this, here I've got a cap on my head. It's got 19 electrodes on it, so you can measure everything, or at least pretty well. And in general, this is the basic formula. You'll see in a few minutes that we can get much more complicated with it. We figured some things out. But at a bare minimum, we're using EEG biofeedback to target certain things. And we are using evocative music, music that's going to assist in moving into that state of consciousness. Very helpful. There's been a lot published recently, you've probably seen, of how important music is for psychedelic experiences. And if you have the right kind of music, it can totally change the experience. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced that, but... and then meditative states. So, this is different because with the psychedelic, right, you're imbibing something that is taking you there kind of whether you want to or not, you're going to go. This is different because it's like, well, you have to somehow learn how to move into that space. Interesting. How do you do that? So it gets a little bit more of that meditative flavor because you have to kind of learn how to navigate your own consciousness. So when we first started this, we've tried a lot of different things. And very first, a shout out to Heather Hargraves. So she did her master's thesis on altered states neurofeedback. And basically what she was doing was a 1 to 20 hertz squash. So taking kind of 1 to 20 hertz as one thing and rewarding decreases of that at the back of the head, PZ, which if you remember those little maps that we put up there, this is pretty much right sitting on top of the hub of the default mode network. Now, even though you're on the scalp and you're not kind of actually on the default mode network, that region is so big back here, the precuneus and the posterior cingulate, that if you put an electrode right here, that's mostly what you're measuring. So it's actually, it works pretty well. So that's what she did her master's thesis on. And she got some interesting data. And so kind of started there. And I met Heather and we kind of shared some ideas. And then I kind of took it and did my own kind of spin on some things. The first thing I did was I said, well, wait a minute. I can do 19 electrodes. I don't have to do just one electrode. And I've got S. Loretta, which means I can toggle down to specific brain regions. So it's like, well, why don't we just go to the default mode network instead of sticking one electrode back here? So that was kind of the next thing. It's like, what if we do 1 to 20 kind of just with the whole default mode network? It didn't quite feel right. So then I backed off and said, well, what if I did the Precuneus? So again, back here, but kind of targeting that region specifically. That worked pretty good. And then this was probably the biggest thing that made the biggest difference. It was like, what if we separate the bands? Instead of putting 1 to 20 hertz and just collapsing everything into one giant band, what if we broke them apart and said, well, let's inhibit everything. Let's inhibit delta. Let's inhibit theta. Let's inhibit alpha. Let's inhibit beta. Let's inhibit all of them, but do it separately. So that you have to... Here's the reason why. Here's the reason that this is important. Is because if you have a 1 to 20 hertz band and you say, I want this to go down. Well, guess what? You could, for instance, let's just pick something. You could take your delta down and everything else could stay the same, or it could even go up and you're still getting rewarded. There's too much wiggle room. With 1 to 20 hertz, your brain can do all kinds of stuff that you don't really have a way to monitor. So, but when you separate it into the bands, you're saying like, nope, all of you have to go down. You can't play around here. So that was actually the biggest thing that really helped us with this. Then we started combining the precuneus with other areas. What if we combine it with the anterior cingulate, kind of up here in the front? Or the medial temporal lobes, what if we do that? Kind of trying to get more to that, hippocampal kinds of stuff. What about coherence? Can we play with coherence? We didn't even talk about that earlier, but coherence is really an issue of connectivity, to kind of simplify it. How different brain regions work together. And so it's like, can we influence that along with this? I'm still working on that aspect. So these were some of the ways that we've kind of targeted this. So what I wanted to do was show you a little bit of a playback of a session so that I can kind of talk you through it and you can kind of see what it would look like. So give me just 1 second here. So this is a playback of an actual session with somebody. That's just the raw activity, and you can see there's some massive alpha in there. If you know what alpha waves look like, that's these guys right here. Those giant sort of sinusoidal, really pretty looking waves. It's a little bit messy on the screen here because it's kind of shortened. But, and let me put some audio feedback on as well. So one more second, and then I'll kind of walk you through this. Okay, so let me explain what we're doing here. So all I do is switch tabs. So you can see down at the bottom there's a bunch of different tabs where I can look at different things. So at first we were just looking at the raw EEG down here. So that was just, that was just this. We can actually use that S-Loretta to look at specific regions and a live 3D. So this is looking at delta in the posterior cingulate. So, we can do that. And we'll come back and look at that in a minute. But this, for me, is the most important screen because this is where I'm kind of working with those feedback thresholds. And I'll explain what I'm talking about in a minute. So this protocol, I'm looking at 4 things. So I've got the default mode network identified as one region that I'm interested in. And it's the 1 to 20 thing. It's like, okay, I want everything between 1 and 20 in the default mode network to go down. So there's a hard line right there. That's the threshold. It's not moving. And then there's a squiggle line. The squiggle line is this person's brainwave activity. It's this person's 1 to 20 hertz in that region. And it goes up and it goes down and it moves around and it shifts because your activity is always changing in your brain, right? So the idea is that this squiggle line representing her brainwaves would have to go below this line. That's the inhibit. You're rewarding it for going down below a certain level. Does that make sense? Okay, here's alpha in the posterior cingulate. So you can see where the alpha's at. By the way, alpha is often very strong in that region. That's kind of where it lives, and it can be very strong. Now, you already saw she had a lot of alpha. So, her alpha activity is going to be pretty high. The threshold, we still can't quite see it. The threshold's down here somewhere. Here's beta in the same region. I want that to go down. And then here's delta. Let me see why I can't see those thresholds. Oh, actually, they're on there. They're just dark purple. And so they're kind of blending in a little bit. Yeah, you can't even see. Here, there's a line right there. It's just dark purple. And this one is down here somewhere. It's way down here. So the idea is that all 4 of these need to be below the threshold at the same time to get some sort of reward, right? So we're kind of encouraging the person to move in that direction. So how do we do that? That's always the biggest question. Well, how do you do that? So evocative music, right? Now you can hardly hear it. We don't have the. Oh, we can try this since I'm not using the microphone. Let's see if this will. We tried this before, and it might. Okay. So we've got some ambient kind of space music playing, right? Now, the volume of that music is connected to this. So the more of these that she has below the threshold, the louder the music's going to be. So basically we set it in such a way that if all of these are above threshold, the music's still on, it's just very quiet. Because what we don't want is the music cutting in, cutting out, cutting in, cutting out. It's super disruptive. That's the way we had it set at the beginning, and it doesn't work. So did you hear that shift? Right. And so what happens is you start to kind of acclimate to that. You're in this space and you start to notice subtleties, right? And look at how our delta dropped. Did you see that? That was much higher before. Now, it's interesting because I don't want to spend way too much time on this because I could spend a lot of time on this. But everybody's a little bit different. This is another thing that's really important that I think we figured out is that you can't just say the key is alpha for everybody. It's not. What? You gotta be kidding me. Okay, all right. Holy smokes. Wow. Oh, look, it was the alpha. She got this down and the alpha down at the same time. So what happens is you start to figure out where your state of consciousness is, and you start to learn to be able to spend more time in that space. In fact, you kind of let it carry you. In fact, often the instructions I'll give people, it's like, follow the music. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? And it's like, you'll see. Because if you try, it's like meditation. If you're trying to meditate, you're probably not meditating. You're probably just making yourself crazy. It's like, just meditate. And so it's like, if you follow the music, you're actually following that state of consciousness. You're just allowing your mind to go there on its own. Some people are much better at it than others. You can imagine. Okay, I've been flagged that I've only got X number of minutes. So
music is binaural beats between 1 and 20?
No, it's not binaural beats. It's the 1 to 20 is the frequency of the brainwaves that we're measuring in that one little box. But in this case, we're not even using binaural beats. And the reason we're not using binaural beats or something like that is because those kinds of technologies tend to increase certain brainwave activation. So those are used like, you're trying to increase alpha, so you use a binaural beat that's going to focus on 10 hertz. But it's increasing alpha. I don't want to increase alpha. I want to decrease alpha. So you can use other technology, but I would be skeptical of using binaural beats for that.
Have you figured what's characteristic of this music that's blocking the frequencies?
It's not the exact music itself that's important necessarily, although we really like that music works really well, that particular track I had on. Partly there's not a rhythm to it that the brain wants to follow. There's no lyrics. It's just kind of background. It kind of has a spaciousness to it. So anything that kind of has that flavor seems to work really well. If you start playing shamanic stuff that's got drums and stuff, there's a rhythm, and you want to engage with it. You don't want something that they're going to engage with. You just want it to be information that is kind of open and spacious. So any music that does that works pretty well. All right. Let's see how much more information I can squeeze in here.
Excuse me. So you're saying that by using this kind of music is, for lack of a better word, superior than using things like the drums or any other kind of music that may have a lyric in it or may have a rhythm to it or may be quite loud or quite quiet, that sort of thing?
It's better for this, not necessarily for a journey, but for this, it's better. Because if you start adding in too many elements, then the brain wants to pay attention to that and it wants to engage with it.
I hear you.
Yeah.
So this is doing, I'm sorry, I'm missing something. So what is this actually then making available?
How do you mean?
Well, okay, like having the music like this
Yeah.
makes something available. And what I'm hearing so far is it makes available a mind that's not trying to do anything except maybe follow this tone.
Well, the volume of the music is connected to the brainwave state. So you're learning your state of consciousness through your brainwaves by the volume of the music. So if the music's at a whisper and you can barely hear it, that's information. It's like you're probably engaged in some thought stream or you're in some other kind of meditative state. As the music starts to increase, that's information telling you, like, there you go. You're moving into the right state of consciousness that we're looking for here. So you're using the volume as information to teach you how to navigate into that territory.
Did the subjects report feeling like they were tripping?
Yes, so here you go. So it depends. That's the short answer. But here's an example. Here's somebody, you can see what the protocol was. The two lines that are dropping dramatically, this is over 25 minutes. This is the delta and alpha. And look how much those are decreasing over the first 15, 17 minutes or something like that. And then there's this giant increase. This is a very typical pattern that we see with this protocol. And having done it enough, at first I was like, what the hell's going on? But having done it enough, I know what's going on. They're letting go, 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 and then the ego freaks out. That is exactly what's going on.
Which is delta and which is alpha?
I'm sorry?
Which
Let's see. The delta is pink.
Alpha's green.
Alpha's green, yeah. Yeah, so this is interesting because what we're starting to see is that the delta and the alpha have a inhibitory effect. They inhibit certain things, and then when you start to disinhibit, that's great for a while until the ego starts to get uncomfortable. And then it wants to resume control. And so you see this pattern consistently. So with this session, this is what the person said. So immediately after, I said, what was going on for you during the session? Because I'm just watching numbers and stuff. I don't know. They're just laying in a chair. I don't know what's going on. And she said it was hard to describe. She felt like she was flying very fast, would slow down, viewing the Milky Way from different viewpoints, seeing the planet throughout humanity's progression. It's like, That's interesting. Felt a collective feeling, communication of thoughts swirling around like visible energy, but couldn't quite understand them. Felt like I was remote viewing, experiencing parts of something yet parts of nothing. All of this was happening at once and yet not at once. And then she said she felt like she was slammed back into her body and felt self-sadness at being bound physically. So it's like, okay, all right, interesting.
Was she just meditating or was she on a psychedelic?
No, she was just doing this. Yeah. Now she has experience with psychedelics. So immediately after, she said she felt like time was distorted. It was hard to find words. She was getting these like rapid flashes of nature in her head. Days after, she emailed me and said she was feeling very introspective, unusually calm and non-reactive, felt very grounded. And she didn't tell me this at the time, but when she was coming into the session, she had a migraine coming on. And she didn't tell me. If she would have told me, I probably would have not done it, which is probably why she didn't tell me. And it went away. Yes?
So sometimes with psychedelics, right, you can have not necessarily like a relapse, but you can have like a recurrence of feeling like you're on the psychedelics way after the case.
Yeah.
Did you do anything to test for that not being the case here and actually being
Let's talk about that. So I got to jump ahead anyway because I don't have enough time. So this, I think, might address that.
Yeah.
So another interesting question that has come up with other people that I've been working with is, could you use this as a way to reactivate a psychedelic state if you've had experience with something big, something like 5-MeO, where it's a very big, powerful experience, and people often are, at least sometimes, will experience a reactivation spontaneously. So it's like, could you facilitate that? So we've looked at that a little bit. That's something we're still kind of checking out. But I've had several different people who have had a 5-MeO experience and come in to see me sometime afterward. And then we've tried this to see what would happen. I want to show you, this is just one person. They came in twice. So demographics real quick here. The first time that he came in was after the first time he'd used 5-MeO. It was about a month after the first time he used 5-MeO. The second time he came in was 4 days after he had had a 5-MeO experience. And so after the session, I had him fill out the Altered States of Consciousness rating scale about the session that we just had. And so if you're not familiar, this is a scale that's used in a lot of psychedelic research to kind of get a sense of the subjective experience. And what I did on this chart was I compared his responses to research that's out there with psilocybin and MDMA. So the orange and the purple lines are psilocybin and MDMA. The white line and the brown line are his responses. The white line was the first time he came in, and the brown line was the second time he came in. So you can see he had some pretty high ratings for things like bliss, insight, disembodiment. His disembodiment was very high both times. Some of the other ones kind of line up with the other research that's out there with psychedelics. So this is very interesting because, in fact, the second time he was like, holy smokes. He came out and he was like, man, I was like this close to sort of being into a full-blown reactivation. It's like he didn't feel like it was totally there, but he was like, man, I could like taste it. And it's like, okay, interesting. And so this is somebody that doesn't have experience with neurofeedback, which is also important because it's like doing a float tank. You know, probably many of you have done a float tank. And the more you do a float tank, you learn how to work with the experience. You can go deeper because you know how to work with it. Neurofeedback's kind of that way. The first couple times you do it, it may or may not do much because you're still trying to learn the ropes and how to do it. So this was encouraging. So this is something we're still exploring. A couple of the lessons from this was that the intensity seems to be influenced by how close it was to the experience with the medicine. So 1 month versus 4 days. The 4 days one was where you had the super high ratings. Makes sense. Set and setting were important. After the first time, he came in and he said, let's use this music. And he brought in his own music. And I said, okay. And that worked. There's individual variability. I had one person come in who, same kind of, after a 5-MeO experience, and we were doing this, and nothing we did worked. We had 5 different sessions, and I was like, I'm at a loss. I'm not sure what else to do here with this person. So again, there's still a lot we have to figure out. Just like alpha's not always the key for everybody. Well, don't know. We're still figuring this out. We've got some overall ideas that seem to work fairly consistently, but there's always going to be people where you gotta. I'm getting the hook. So some of the other things that we've been doing quickly is starting to layer things. So the music is nice and that works really well. But we've done things like add a sub pack, which creates a vibro tactile experience of the music. So you feel it on your back. It vibrates with the music. That is pretty cool. And that works very nicely. You can hook that to the neurofeedback, so the intensity of the vibration is also giving you feedback about how deep your state is. You can do that with the Proteus light and sound machine as well. Hook that into it so that the lights flickering in your eyes are also connected to the sound, also connected to the vibration. Now, what we found is that for most people, that is too much. Most people like 2 things. They don't like 3 things.
Lights are mostly driving entrainment, right?
Well, but these are kind of dancing with the music.
Oh, okay, so it's not.
So it's not driving, yeah. But it's just a lot of stimulation. Using things like more invasive kind of pushing the brain in certain ways, either using photobiomodulation or low power repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. With other medicines, so we've been looking at what happens if you microdose and do these sessions while microdosing. That's interesting. Or using cannabis prior to a session. And those all seem very productive, potentially. So those are things we're working with. And then, of course, virtual reality, seeing how that can be incorporated. So we're going to have time to visit as a group, and I'm happy to talk with any of you individually. If you're interested in kind of going further with some of what we're up to, we offer 3-day workshops teaching people how to use not just the altered states, but all 5 of the states that we work with neurofeedback. The most recent one, this one actually just sold out. If you want to go to Mallorca or Germany, we've got some coming up. I also was talking to somebody before our session tonight, and if there is interest, I would be totally happy to come down in San Francisco and do a workshop. So, yeah. So if you're interested, contact me, and I'll kind of start a list. And if we have enough people, then we'll just do something here. Huh? Sorry.
Can you buy your setup, the neurofeedback setup?
Yeah. The equipment's not mine. I just buy it from another company, and then I've developed the protocols. And then when people come to the workshop, I give them all the protocols. I give them all the stuff. You have everything you need. I did it. I only skipped about 6 slides. So, yeah. Oh, thank you.
What were some of the most notable differences and similarities with the altered state, the 5th one, with the other 4?
Yeah, that's a great question. So can everybody hear that? So the most notable differences between the 5th style and the other 4 styles. The other 4 styles, there is some level of effort involved. I'm so cautious to use that word because with meditation, it's like, But you are directing your attention in a very specific way, with the other styles. And with this one, you have to just kind of like let go. It's more about letting go and allowing sort of things to just unfold. So you're not really directing your attention, but you do have to learn how to sort of move into that territory. It's a weird space. I didn't fully answer it, but that's probably the best I can do. There was yes, yeah.
So I just have a question. Are the subjects that you're working with, are they blinded at all, or do they have expectations of what they should feel or think? So when you interview them, do they already have a sense of what they think you want to hear, or do they not really know what they're getting into?
You're right. So that's a great question, and I want to say a couple of quick things about it. One is, so the quick little case study that I put up, I would not say that that's the typical response. So somebody having this like pretty much sounds like a psychedelic experience, I would say that's more atypical. So a lot of times people will do the experience, their brain waves go down, it looks really good, and they come out like, how you doing? And they're like, fine. It's like, anything interesting happen? It's like, no. They're like, okay. So it's interesting because, and that's where some of the other technologies come in. When you layer some of the things, you can kind of facilitate a little bit of a more letting go. So even though they can shift their brainwaves, they're still not letting go fully in some way. And so adding that stimulation seems to kind of help with that. The other part of the question, do they have an expectation coming in? By and large, no. And partly it's because the way that, especially at the beginning when I was kind of experimenting, I was very careful about who I chose to work with that. And I told them, it's like, we're just trying something here. So, we didn't really have expectations. The other people that I work with, I have different reasons for going into these states. So I didn't get to talk about that a whole lot, but don't look, Josh. We can't look at that. Don't look at it. But these are some of the things that we're seeing could be potential benefits of doing this type of work. Creating flexibility in your internal state, creativity, learning how to let go. Who doesn't need to learn how to let go better? Moving past your defenses. For me, this is a huge one. Actually, personally, this is a huge one. It's like I have a really strong defense structure psychologically, which is great and also not great. And so it's like learning, how do you let that go? How do you let your defenses go? So you can see like psychologically where that could be really beneficial. These other things, PTSD recovery. There's other research being done by a group in Canada. They've got 5 publications that I know of where they're rewarding decreases of alpha in the Precuneus as a treatment for PTSD. And they're getting great results. So again, how is this all connected, right? I mean, so I think there's a lot of potential applications. We didn't even get to talk about things like sustaining the afterglow. There's ways that you can actually map somebody during the afterglow phase of a psychedelic experience and then use that as a baseline to train them back to their own afterglow state.
Wow.
Yeah.
What have you noticed when you've used Violite, and have you done any work where Violite is the only feedback?
No. So that is, at the moment, we've either been using it sort of sequentially, use V-Light and then you do a session, but we have not married them yet. There's a way to do it where they're happening together and that the V-Light is actually providing feedback as well. So it only comes on when the brain is in a certain state, and if the brain's not in a state, it goes off. It's set up to do that. That's just kind of like on the edge of where we're at right now. Okay, one more, and then I think we have to break. Yeah.
So have you actually done any recordings of people while they're tripping, and then use that to kind of entrain that state, so that you're trying to basically replicate the psychedelic experience for people?
Yes, and the limited amount that we've done with that, it doesn't really seem to be any better than kind of what I'm proposing here. the exception that I would say to that is if that afterglow piece, kind of what the brain looks like a day or 2 days after, is pretty individualized. And so it's really, you kind of have to map that person and see, and you know, we don't know enough yet. And it may be individual with the medicine. You know, peyote may look different than mushrooms. And, you know, because they feel different. You know, when you are in those experiences, they don't feel the same. They have a different flavor to them. So it makes sense to me that it might look a little bit different in your brain in that, you know, that day 2 or 2 after. Okay, we should pause here because I'm already way over. Thanks for being patient with me.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.